While cleaning out a dead stranger's basement, I accidentally uncovered a fraud so perfectly executed that it erased itself from history. It took 80 years, a shoebox, and a very patient paralegal to drag it back into the light. I want to preface this by saying I am not a dramatic person. I am a 44-year-old paralegal with a bad habit of buying fixer-uppers at county auctions, a collection of highlighters organized by use case, and a cat named Exhibit A. I tell you this so you understand that what follows is not the story of someone who went looking for trouble. I am someone who bought a house for $31,000 and found trouble waiting for me in the basement, patient as a stone, having waited 80 years for someone like me to show up. This is going to be long. Get comfortable. Background: the house. Last April, I drove 40 minutes outside the city to attend a county tax auction. I'd been to a dozen of these over the years, bought 3 properties total, fixed 2 of them up and sold them, kept one as a rental. It's a side hobby that scratches the itch for puzzles that my day job as a paralegal at a real estate law firm only partially satisfies. The property I had my eye on was listed as a 1920s craftsman bungalow on just under an acre, sitting on the edge of a small rural township called Grayfield. The county assessor's photos showed it needed work: sagging porch, broken windows, what appeared to be a family of birds living rent-free in the eaves, but the bones looked solid in the listing photos, and the neighborhood comps, while sparse, suggested I could flip it for a reasonable profit if I put in 3 to 4 months of work. I won the bid at $31,200. Nobody else seemed interested. I drove out the following Saturday with my contractor friend Donna to do a proper walkthrough. The house smelled like time, like old newspaper and something floral that had been fighting a losing battle against mildew for a decade. The previous owner, according to the county records, was a man named Gerald Alton Mosswick, who had died intestate in 2019 at the age of 91. He had no surviving relatives on record. The house had sat for 5 years while the county processed the estate and eventually moved it to auction. Gerald Mosswick, I would come to learn, was a man who kept everything. The main floor and upper level were cluttered but not dangerous. Stacked newspapers, furniture draped in sheets, closets full of clothes that smelled like cedar and old wool. Donna and I made our notes, took our measurements, began assembling the mental renovation budget. Then we went to the basement. The box. The basement was dry, which was the first miracle. Proper stone foundation, good drainage, and someone at some point had installed a dehumidifier that had long since died but had done its work faithfully for years before giving out. The second miracle was the shelving, floor to ceiling along 3 walls, everything labeled in a small, precise hand on pieces of masking tape. Tax records by year. Utility bills. Car maintenance logs. Gerald Mosswick had organized his entire life down here. On the bottom shelf in the far left corner, tucked behind a plastic bin of Christmas ornaments, I found a shoebox. No label. That alone made it stand out. Inside were letters. Not a few, close to 60 of them, organized chronologically with rubber bands, the rubber bands having long since fused into a kind of archaeological layer against the envelopes. They spanned from 1941 to 1974, and they were correspondence between Gerald Mosswick's father, a man named Harold Clement Mosswick, and an attorney named R.T. Beaumont of Beaumont and Associates, located in the county seat. I almost put them back. I was there to assess renovation costs, not read old mail. But then I saw the phrase on the first letter I opened, written in the attorney's careful formal script: the matter of the parcel as previously described, which no longer appears in the current assessment rolls and which we must accept, for the time being, as lost to record. Lost to record. I sat down on the concrete floor of Gerald Mosswick's basement with that shoebox in my lap, and I read every single letter. What the letters said. I'm going to summarize here because the full picture took me weeks to piece together, and even with a paralegal's familiarity with property language and legal correspondence, I had to read some of these letters 3 or 4 times. Harold Mosswick had owned, in addition to the house I just purchased, a separate parcel of land. Approximately 14 acres, described in the letters as lying northeast of the house property, bounded on one side by a creek called Sutter's Branch. Harold had inherited it from his own father in 1938. It was farmland, not exceptional, but productive. Harold had leased it to a neighboring family for a modest annual payment. In 1943, Harold received a notice from the county assessor's office informing him that his property taxes for the northeast parcel were in arrears. He was confused. He had been paying them. He wrote to Beaumont. Beaumont investigated. What they found, as pieced together across a dozen letters over the following 2 years, was this: the northeast parcel had been quietly removed from the official assessment rolls. Not seized, not condemned, not legally transferred. Simply removed. Harold's name no longer appeared as owner of record. When Beaumont dug into the deed history, the most recent deed on file for the parcel had been re-recorded. The word Beaumont used was supplanted by a new deed transferring ownership to a man named Cresswell D. Farrow. Cresswell D. Farrow, the letters made clear, was the county assessor at the time. Harold and Beaumont spent years trying to fight this. The letters chart the slow collapse of their effort, witnesses who wouldn't speak, a county clerk who claimed the old records were water-damaged, a judge who dismissed their challenge on procedural grounds in 1947. By 1951, Beaumont's letters take on a different tone. Harold, I must counsel you in the strongest possible terms that to continue this pursuit is to spend money you cannot recover against walls that will not move. The Farrow family is established here. I am sorry. I am deeply sorry. But I do not believe we will win this in my lifetime or yours. Harold's last letter in the box was dated March 1974. He was in his late 60s by then, Beaumont long since retired or dead, the letter addressed to some unnamed recipient, perhaps just written for himself, perhaps intended for Gerald. It said, among other things, I want it written down that I never accepted it. I never agreed that that land was theirs. It was stolen by a man who had the county seal on his desk and the sheriff drinking his whiskey. I want whoever finds this to know that. The land is real. It is there. Sutter's branch still runs. And it was ours. I sat with that letter for a long time. Then I took out my phone and started making notes. Update 1. The research begins, weeks 1 to 3. Let me be honest about my motivations here, because I want this to be a truthful account. I was not purely altruistic. Harold Moswick was dead. Gerald Moswick was dead. There was no family waiting to reclaim stolen land. Whatever I found would not be going back to the Moswicks. But here's the thing about working in real estate law for 19 years. You develop opinions about property fraud. Strong ones. And you develop a particular, almost physical revulsion for the idea of a theft that worked, that succeeded so completely it erased itself from the record and sat there for 80 years, untouched, the thief's descendants perhaps still benefiting from it, the original crime composting quietly into legitimacy. I wanted to know if the land was still there. I wanted to know who had it now. And yes, I wanted to understand if there was any legal avenue remaining, however unlikely, because I am a paralegal and that is simply how my brain is wired. I started with the county's online deed records, which only went back to 1980. I filed a formal records request for the physical deed books from the 1930s through 1950s. This cost me $45 and a week of waiting. While I waited, I went to the county library and found their archive of historical tax maps. These are large, unwieldy documents, hand-drawn, organized by township. I found the Grayfield Township maps from 1935, 1940, and 1945. In 1935 and 1940, Harold C. Moswick was clearly listed as the owner of 2 parcels, the house property and a separate parcel northeast of it, labeled with a handwritten acreage notation of 14A. In the 1945 map, the house parcel still bore Harold's name. The northeast parcel bore a different notation. The original name had been written over, not erased, written over, the original ink still faintly visible beneath, with the name Farrow. I took photographs of all 3 maps. My hands were steady. Internally, I was vibrating like a tuning fork. The deed records arrived. I took them back to my office, my actual office at the law firm, after hours, with the permission of my supervising attorney Margaret, who I had told about the letters and who had responded by saying, "Oh, that's interesting," and then immediately saying, "You should document everything and I want to hear all of it." Margaret is the best kind of attorney. She has been practicing real estate law for 31 years and she reacts to potential fraud the way some people react to a really good meal. I spent 2 evenings with the deed books. The story they told was largely consistent with what Beaumont's letters had described, with one additional detail. The deed that transferred the parcel to Cresswell Farrow in 1943 was witnessed and notarized by the county clerk of that era, a man named Burton Lyle. The deed was recorded 2 days after Harold's tax arrears notice was sent. The timing was not subtle. The men involved had not, apparently, felt any need to be subtle. They had simply done it and trusted that Harold Moswick, a farmer, not a lawyer, without connections, would not be able to undo it. They had been right. For 80 years they had been right. Update 2. Finding the land, weeks 4 to 6. The deed history after Cresswell Farrow was, in its own way, informative. Cresswell Farrow had held the parcel until his death in 1961. It passed to his son, Randall Farrow. Randall sold it in 1979 to a land holding company called Grayfield Agricultural Partners. Grayfield Agricultural Partners was dissolved in 1991, its assets liquidated in what appeared to be an internal dissolution. The parcel passed to a man named Douglas Thane, who was listed as the company's registered agent. Douglas Thane held it until 2003, when he sold it to a company called Tri-State Land Holdings, LLC. Tri-State Land Holdings, LLC currently held it. I ran Tri-State Land Holdings through the state corporate registry. It was a Delaware LLC with a registered agent service as its only public contact, the kind of corporate structure that is entirely legal and also specifically designed to make it difficult to find out who actually owns anything. Margaret, when I showed her this, made a sound of professional recognition. "Classic passive land hold," she said. "Somebody bought it for speculation and has been sitting on it. Probably got it cheap from Thane, who probably got it cheap from the dissolution. Chain of unknowing buyers, potentially." "Does that matter?" I asked. "For any kind of action?" She leaned back in her chair. "Honestly, after 80 years, almost certainly not in terms of getting the land back. Adverse possession alone would have run. Statute of limitations on the original fraud has been dead for decades. But," she paused, in the way that Margaret pauses when something is interesting, "that doesn't mean the story isn't worth telling. And it doesn't mean there's nothing here." I drove out to Grayfield on a Saturday in late May. I had the 1940 tax map, the deed descriptions from the historical records, and a current county parcel map I'd pulled from the assessor's GIS system. I parked on a gravel road and walked. Sutter's Branch was there, exactly where it should have been, running northeast of the house property, the same creek that Harold Moswick had described in his letters as the boundary of his land. The parcel itself was overgrown, scrubby second-growth trees, old fence line half collapsed into the weeds, but the bones of farmland were still visible. The slope of the ground. The richness of the soil where I kicked aside the grass. 14 acres, approximately, just as Harold had said. I stood there for a while. The creek made the same sound it had made in 1943. Whatever men had done to the paper, they had not moved the water. I took 100 photographs. I noted the current fence line, the road access, the neighboring parcels. Then I went home and wrote up everything I had in a 30-page memo that I formatted, out of professional habit, exactly as I would for a case file. Update 3, the question of what to do, weeks 7 to 12. This is the part of the story where I had to make decisions, and I want to walk through them carefully because I think they matter. Option 1. Do nothing. I had a renovation to finish. The land was not mine, the Moswicks were dead, and the legal avenues for recovery were almost certainly foreclosed by time. I could put the letters in an archive box, finish the kitchen cabinets, and sell the house in October. Option 2. Pursue legal action myself. This was not realistic. Even if Margaret agreed to take it pro bono, which I had not asked and would not ask, the legal barriers were enormous. 80 years of subsequent title transfers, adverse possession, bona fide purchaser protections. The theft was real and documentable, but the remedy was effectively gone. Option 3. Make the record. This was the option I chose. Let me explain what I mean. Harold Moswick had wanted it written down. He had said exactly that in his last letter. He had not been able to fight in the courts. The courts had been controlled by the same apparatus that had taken his land. But he had kept the letters. He had kept the maps. He had organized everything in that basement with the same meticulous faith that evidence matters, that truth written down survives longer than the men who tried to bury it. I was a paralegal. Making the record was something I knew how to do. I started by writing a formal historical title report, the kind of document we produce at the firm for complex title history cases, documenting every deed, every transaction, every discrepancy I had found, from Harold's original title through to Tri-State Land Holdings LLC's current ownership. I sourced every claim. I footnoted every document. I cross-referenced the letters against the county records, against the tax maps, against the deed books. The report was 57 pages when I finished it. I sent a copy to the County Historical Society, with a cover letter explaining its origin and significance. I sent a copy to the County Recorder's Office, formally requesting that the historical record of the disputed transfer be noted in a manner consistent with their document preservation policies. I sent a copy to the state's Land Records Division. And I sent a copy, with a carefully worded cover letter, to the investigative reporter at the regional newspaper who had, 2 years prior, written an award-winning series about historical property fraud in rural counties. Her name was Jenna Olcott. I had read her series when it came out and thought it was excellent work. I did not make any legal claims. I did not allege current wrongdoing by current owners. I was careful, because Margaret reviewed every letter before I sent it. I simply documented what the historical record showed, made the record available to those whose job it was to hold records, and made it available to a journalist whose job it was to tell stories that mattered. Then I went back to sanding floors. Update 4. What happened next? Months 3 to 6. Jenna Olcott called me 12 days after I sent her the report. She had, in those 12 days, done her own research. She confirmed the deed irregularities independently. She found, in the county court archives, the original case file from Harold and Beaumont's 1947 legal challenge, the one that had been dismissed on procedural grounds, which contained additional documentary evidence of the disputed ownership. She had also, through methods she did not entirely disclose to me, identified the principals behind Tri-State Land Holdings LLC. It's a family trust, she told me. Second generation from Douglas Thane. His kids set it up when he died. They've been holding the parcel as a long-term land investment. I don't think they have any idea about the 1943 history. Do you think they're culpable for what happened in 1943? Legally? No, probably not. Morally? She paused. That's a more interesting question. Her article ran in the regional paper 6 weeks later. It was thorough, careful, and damning in the way that only precise historical documentation can be damning. She traced the 1943 transfer in detail, named Cresswell Farrow and Burton Lyle, documented the apparent mechanism of the fraud, reproduced photographs of the altered tax maps, and quoted extensively from Harold Moswick's letters, particularly his last one. She also reported that the County Historical Society had received the title report and was in the process of formally documenting it. She reported that the County Recorder's Office had acknowledged receipt of the materials. She did not allege current wrongdoing by Tri-State Land Holdings or the Thane Family Trust. But she named them as the current title holders of a parcel with a documented history of fraudulent origin, in a regional newspaper that people in that county read. I am told, by Jenna, who kept me updated as a source, that the article generated more reader response than almost anything else the paper had published that year. Rural land theft resonates in rural communities. People have long memories. Several elderly residents of Grayfield contacted the paper to say they remembered the Moswick family, remembered the land dispute, had heard their own parents reference it in terms that had always seemed to them like local legend rather than documented fact. It was now documented fact. The second thing that happened was quieter, and it took longer, and I almost missed it. About 5 months after I sent the initial report to the County Recorder's Office, I received a letter from a woman named Patricia Dowell, who identified herself as a genealogist working on behalf of a client. She had seen the newspaper article. Her client, she wrote, was a man named James Elton Moswick, who was 73 years old and lived in Arizona. He was Harold Moswick's grandson, the child of a son Harold had apparently had by a first marriage, before Gerald's mother, a son who had moved west in the 1950s and with whom Harold had lost contact. This branch of the family had never appeared in the county's intestate records because nobody had known to look for them. James Moswick was Gerald's half-nephew. I forwarded Patricia Dowell's letter to Margaret. Margaret, whose eyes I watched sharpen when she read it, said, "Well, that changes some things." Update 5, the resolution, months 7 to 8. I want to be precise here about what was and was not legally possible. Margaret, after consulting with 2 colleagues who specialized in contested title and estate recovery, confirmed what I had suspected: a direct action to recover the land itself was not viable. 80 years of title history, bona fide purchaser protections for the Thane Family Trust, who had purchased legitimately from Thane, who had purchased legitimately from Grayfield Agricultural Partners, and so on back up the chain, and the running of every relevant statute of limitations made a recovery action almost certainly a losing proposition and an expensive one. But James Moswick, as Harold's surviving heir through a line that had never been identified in the estate proceedings, potentially had a claim against Gerald's estate, which had not been fully closed, the county having sold the house property at auction rather than distributing estate assets through a proper probate proceeding because there had been no identified heirs. This is a narrow, technical point, and I do not want to oversell it. But it was something. Margaret filed a petition to reopen the probate proceeding on James Moswick's behalf. She did this pro bono. She said, when I thanked her, that she had been practicing real estate law for 31 years, and this was the most interesting case she had seen in at least 15 of them, and that was payment enough. I did not argue. The petition was filed in September. The house I had bought at auction was technically part of an estate that had not been properly distributed, because the estate had an heir who had not been identified. The county's auction had been procedurally premature. This was, legally, a complicated situation. It was also, in a more direct sense, the moment I had to reckon with something I'd been not quite thinking about for 8 months. I had bought that house for $31,200. I had spent approximately $28,000 in materials and labor on the renovation. I had my own claim to consider. The auction purchase had been conducted in good faith. Margaret was careful to tell me that my interests were protected, that James Moswick's potential estate claim would not simply erase my purchase, that good faith auction buyers have recognized protections. But I had also stood at Sutter's Branch in May and read Harold Moswick's letter to whoever might someday find it. James Moswick flew in from Arizona in October. He was a quiet man, 73, a retired mechanic with a grandson who came with him because James didn't love flying and liked the company. He had never known Gerald. He had known almost nothing about his father's side of the family in Ohio. He had read the newspaper article, contacted Patricia Dowell, and then spent 3 months working up the courage to see if any of it was real. I took him to the house. I showed him the basement. I had left the shelving units exactly as Gerald had arranged them, and I watched James Moswick walk slowly along the rows, reading the masking tape labels, and I saw the moment it became real to him, the evidence of a man's organized, careful, documented life, a half-uncle he had never met, who had kept everything. I showed him the shoebox. The letters. He read Harold's last letter standing up, beside the shelf where I'd found it, and he didn't say anything for a while. He wanted someone to find this, James said finally. Yes, I said. He did. The outcome. The probate matter is still working through the court, so I cannot speak to its ultimate resolution. What I can tell you is this. Margaret negotiated an agreement in principle between James Moswick's interests and the county that acknowledges the procedural irregularities in the original auction proceeding. The specifics are not finalized, and I've been asked not to detail them publicly. What I can say is that James Moswick will receive something, and that something is more than nothing, which is what Harold's grandson had on the day I found that shoebox. Regarding the land itself, Jenna Olcott followed up her original article with a second piece. This one focused on the Thane family trust's response to the documented history of their land's title. The trust, through an attorney, stated that they were aware of the historical reporting on the parcel and were reviewing their position. 3 weeks after that statement, the trust listed the parcel for sale. The listing price was modest for 14 acres with road access and creek frontage. The listing description did not mention the title history. I don't know who will buy it. I don't know what will happen to it. What I know is that it is no longer a secret. The deed books have been corrected, not in ownership. That ship sailed in 1947 and never came back, but in the historical annotation. The county recorder's office, after Margaret spent 2 weeks corresponding with them, agreed to attach a historical notation to the parcel record documenting the disputed 1943 transfer and referencing the title report on file. Anyone who searches that parcel's history will find the story. The fraud will not sit quietly inside the record anymore, presenting itself as ordinary history. Reflection. I finished the renovation in November. New kitchen, refinished floors, updated electrical, the porch rebuilt from the slab up. The house is beautiful in the way that old craftsman houses are beautiful when someone takes them seriously. Not perfect, not modern, but solid and warm and built for people to actually live in. I listed it in December and accepted an offer in the first week. The buyers are a young couple. They have a dog. The wife is a librarian. Before closing, I made photocopies of all the letters, the maps, and the title report. I gave one complete set to the County Historical Society, one to Jenna Olcott, and one to James Moswick, who flew back out for the closing and shook my hand in the driveway after. What are you going to do with your copy? I asked him. He thought about it. My grandson is studying history at Ohio State, he said. I think he'll want to write about it someday. I kept my own copy. It lives in a labeled file box in my home office, between 2 other case files. The label says, Moswick, Harold C., Northeast Parcel, 14 acres, Sutter's Branch. I think about Harold Moswick sometimes, sitting in his basement in 1974, writing his last letter to nobody in particular. He had lost. He knew he had lost. The courts had turned him away. The men who had taken his land were either dead or had passed their benefits to their children, and the world had moved on without acknowledging what had been done to him. But he had kept the letters. He had put them in a shoebox and labeled the shelf and arranged his life around them in that dry, organized basement, and he had trusted, against all reasonable evidence, that it mattered to write things down. That truth kept in a box was better than truth abandoned. He was right. It just took 80 years and a woman with a highlighter collection and a cat named Exhibit A to prove it. TLDR, bought a house at auction. Found letters in the basement documenting a 1943 land theft by a corrupt county assessor. Spent 8 months making the historical record, found a living heir, and got a reporter involved. The land won't go back to the Moswicks. That fight was lost before I was born, but it's not a secret anymore, and Harold's grandson knows his family's story. Sometimes that's what justice looks like when it arrives 80 years late. Edit. Yes, Exhibit A is named for professional reasons and also because she is extremely judgmental and sits on important documents. Edit 2. For everyone asking if I can share the letters, I've donated copies to the County Historical Society, which will make them part of the public archive in the next catalog cycle. Jenna Olcott's 2 articles are findable if you search the regional paper by subject. I'm keeping the family-specific county private for James Moswick's sake while the probate matter is open. Edit 3. Margaret says hello and also that she has been in real estate law for 31 years and fraud is fraud regardless of which century it happened in. She asked me to include that.